The chapel bell had not finished ringing when Sergeant Tomas Ardle reached out from the hospital bed and closed his hand around my wrist, and even then, with the strength all but gone out of him, his grip was a soldier's grip. I had stood beside that man on the cold stone of the Sallow Gate for 11 winters. I had seen his hand steady on the rifle through a gale that tore slates off the guardhouse roof. So when those fingers tightened on me one last time, I leaned in, because I knew Tomas Ardle did not waste a movement, and he did not waste a breath, and whatever he meant to say with the breath he had left was going to be the most important thing in the room. "Ren," he said, my name. He always called me by my surname the way old guardsmen do. "There's a duty I won't be able to keep." I told him to rest. I told him there was nothing he had to keep, that he had kept more than his share, that the wall would stand without him for 1 season. I was lying to a dying man, and we both knew it, and he forgave me the way he forgave everything, with a small tightening at the corner of his mouth that on Tomas passed for a smile. "Listen to me," he said. "Saturday week, the interment of Color Sergeant Holly's vein at the garrison ground above Marrow Field. He has no one. I gave him my word I would stand at his head and see him laid down properly. I will not be standing." His eyes, gone the color of old pewter, found mine and held them. "You will stand it for me. You'll stand it exactly as it ought to be stood." "Promise me, corporal." I promised. A man does not refuse that. I would have promised him the moon out of the sky. What I did not understand, leaning over that bed with my throat closing, was that I had just agreed to the hardest thing I would ever do in the uniform, harder than any night on the wall, harder than any drunk who ever grabbed at my belt or any official who ever ordered me to move. Because it is one thing to keep a promise to a living man. It is another thing entirely to keep it for the dead, when the dead cannot tell you whether you've kept it right. Tomas Ardle died before dawn the next morning. He went the way he stood his post, quietly, on time, without complaint. I want to tell you about the promise, and what it cost, and what it gave back. But first you have to understand who we are, the men of the Sallow Gate, and why a word given is not a small thing among us. We are the KingsGuard of a household older than the roads that lead to it. I will not name the king, nor the house, nor the dead king's fathers, because we do not put those names in the mouths of strangers. That is part of the discipline too. What I can tell you is the shape of the life. We stand. That is the whole of it and the heart of it. We stand at the gate in the red wool and the bearskin and the white gloves, with the rifle at the order and the chinstrap biting. And we do not move when the tourists lean their phones an inch from our faces. And we do not move when the rain runs down inside the collar. And we do not move when a child cries or a fool shouts or a clever young man tries to make us laugh for his friends. The stillness is not emptiness. Behind that unmoving face a man is doing the hardest work there is, which is choosing, second by second, not to be the thing the world keeps trying to make him into. The world wants a reaction. We give it discipline instead. And discipline, in the end, is only a promise you make to yourself and keep when no one is watching to see you keep it. So when an old guardsman gives his word, it carries the freight of every still hour he ever stood. Tomas had given his word to Holly's vein. Now I carried it, and it weighed more than the rifle ever had. I knew the name, in the way you know a legend you've never quite touched. Holly's vein had been color sergeant of the old Marrow Company 2 generations before mine, the company that no longer existed, folded and renumbered after a reorganization before I was born. He had carried the company color, the great silk standard, through ceremonies my grandfather might have watched as a boy, and he had outlived all of it. Outlived the company, outlived the men he served with, outlived a wife, and I would learn a son. By the time he died in a narrow room above a shuttered ironmonger's, blind in one eye and nearly so in the other, Holly's vein was the last living man of the Marrow Company. The very last. When he went down into the ground, an entire company of soldiers, every face, every name, every cold morning they ever stood together would go silent in the world forever, because he was the last mouth that still remembered them. That was the man Tomas had promised to stand for, and now I understood why my sergeant, with the little breath he had left, had spent it on this. It was not sentiment. To a guardsman, the worst thing in the world is not death. The worst thing is to be unwitnessed, to stand your whole life and have no one stand for you at the end. Tomas could not bear that the last man of an entire company should go into the earth with no soldier at his head. He had given his word it would not happen, and he had handed that word to me with his dying hand. I went to my company sergeant major the morning after Tomas died, before I had even slept, still in the clothes I'd worn to the hospital. CSM Down was a granite block of a man who had buried more friends than I had years in the service, and he listened to the whole of it without his expression changing by a hair. Sergeant Ardle gave his word, I finished. I gave mine to him. I mean to keep it, sir. I'm asking to be released from the wall that Saturday to stand the interment of Color Sergeant Vane. Down was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the thing I had not expected, the thing that turned a private promise into something far larger. You won't stand it alone, Corporal. I did not understand him yet. I thought he meant he'd find me a second man, a bearer party, the bare minimum so I wouldn't be one figure in an empty field. I thanked him and turned to go. Wren, his voice stopped me at the door. Did Ardle ever tell you why he made the promise in the first place? Why a serving sergeant would give his word to bury an old man from a company that doesn't exist anymore? I admitted he had not. There had been no time. There is never enough time. That is the lesson the dying keep trying to teach the living, and we keep not learning it. Down looked at me a moment longer, and something moved behind his granite face. Something I would not understand for another week. Something that would change what the promise meant and make it heavier and, in the end, make it the kind of thing that does not stay private, that gets out into the world no matter how quietly you try to do it, and moves every soul it touches. Then you'll find out when you find out, he said. Go and sleep, Corporal, you've a duty to learn. I did not sleep. I went instead to the regimental archive, a low room beneath the old riding school where the dust lay thick on a century of leather-bound order books, and I asked the clerk for everything the household held on the Marrow Company and on Color Sergeant Holly's Vane. It was thinner than it should have been. A company that folds gets boxed and shelved and slowly forgotten, and Marrow had folded a long time ago. But there was a service file, and a photograph gone sepia at the edges, and a single folded order from the day the company was stood down for the last time. I sat with the photograph a long while, 20-odd young men in a forecourt I did not recognize, squinting into a sun that had set on every one of them. And there, third from the right in the front rank, broad-shouldered and unsmiling, a young man whose face I almost knew, and it took me a full minute to understand why I almost knew it. He had the same heavy brow, the same set to the jaw, as the granite man who had just told me to go and sleep. I turned the photograph over. Someone had written the names in faded ink. Third from the right, front rank, *L/CPLA down. I sat very still in that dusty room the way I had been trained to sit still. CSM Down had served in the Marrow Company. Down knew Holly's Vane, not as a name in a file, as a man he had stood beside, 60 years gone when they were both young and the company was whole. That was why he had not corrected me when I said I would stand it alone. You won't stand it alone. He had not meant a bearer party. He had meant himself. But that was not the half of it, and I would not learn the rest for days. I threw myself at the duty the way you attack any task you are terrified of getting wrong. An interment is not a parade. There is a protocol for laying a soldier to rest, and there is a deeper, older protocol for laying a *color* soldier to rest, a man who carried the standard, and almost no one living had stood that older ceremony, because almost no one living had buried a color sergeant of a vanished company. I went looking for how it ought to be done, and I kept hitting the same wall. The men who knew were dead. The drill had died with the company that practiced it. So I did what a guardsman does when the manual fails him. I went to the oldest living memory I could find. CSM Down did not want to talk about Holly's vein. I understood that later. But he gave me the drill, cold and precise, standing in the empty drill shed with a broom handle for a color pike, walking me through the slow march, the 3 pauses, the lowering of the standard over the open ground, the way the bearer must time his pace to the bell so that the color comes to rest at the exact moment the man does. He made me do it 40 times. He made me do it until the broom handle felt like the silk weight of a real standard, until I could feel the 3 pauses in my chest without counting them. And the whole time his face stayed granite, except once, when I got the second pause a half beat wrong, and he said, not unkindly, "Hollies would have had your hide for that," and then stopped himself, as if he'd said too much, and made me start again from the gate. I should tell you what was at stake, because by now you may think this is only an old man burying an older one, and a young corporal fussing over drill. It was more than that. Word had begun to move. It always does. A serving guardsman, released from the wall to bury the last man of a company nobody remembered, the kind of thing that ought to happen in an empty field with 2 soldiers, and a chaplain had, somehow, started to gather weight. The chaplain mentioned it to the verger. The verger mentioned it to the Old Soldiers Association. And the Old Soldiers Association, which exists for exactly this, for the men the world forgets, began to make quiet telephone calls. By the Wednesday, I heard that veterans were coming, not many. A dozen, perhaps, old men in old blazers with their medals up, who had heard that the last of the Marrow Company was going down and could not let it happen without standing for him. By the Thursday, it was 30. By the Friday, I had stopped asking, because the number was no longer the point. The point was that the promise Tomas Ardle gave from a hospital bed had escaped the room, and now there would be witnesses. And if I got the drill wrong, I would get it wrong in front of men who had given their whole lives to getting things right. That was the pressure. Here is the thing that nearly broke me. The night before the interment, I went back to the archive to sit one last time with the file, the way you check your kit, one last time before a duty you cannot fail. And the clerk, who had grown kind to me over the week, said there was one more thing he'd found, mislaid in the wrong box, and did I want it? It was a second photograph, younger than the first, 2 young guardsmen, arms across each other's shoulders, grinning the way only men who have just survived something grin. One of them was unmistakably a young Holly's vein. The other, broad brow, heavy jaw, was a young Down, and written on the back in a hand I did not recognize, Holly's and Arthur. The day Arthur's boy was born, Holly stood godfather. Arthur, CSM Arthur Down, and Holly's vein had been godfather to his son. I went looking then for what had happened to the son. Because the file had told me Holly's vein outlived his own boy, and I had read it past, the way you read past a line that's too heavy to lift. A son, lost in service. I had assumed Holly's his son, but the dates would not line up, and a cold certainty was rising in me, and I made the clerk pull the casualty rolls, and I found it. The son who was lost in service was not Holly's vein's son. Holly's vein had no son of his own. The son was Down's, the boy Holly's had stood godfather to, killed 20 years back in a country I will not name, in a uniform the household no longer issues. And Holly's vein, the boy's godfather, the boy's father's oldest friend, had been the one to bring the news to Arthur Down's door, and had stood beside him at that grave, and had, in the years after, become the only living soul who still spoke the boy's name aloud, because a grieving father cannot always do it, and a godfather sometimes must. That was why Tomas Ardle had promised to stand for Holly's vein. Tomas had served under Down. Tomas had known the whole of it. And Tomas had understood, the way good soldiers understand, that when the last man who still spoke your dead son's name was himself going into the ground, somebody had to stand for him. Because if no one stood for Holly's, then the boy's name would go silent too, twice over, and a father would lose his son a second time. I sat in the dust with the photograph in my white-gloved hand, and I understood at last that the promise I had inherited was not one promise. It was a chain of them, link upon link, running back 60 years to two young men grinning in a forecourt. And tomorrow, in a field above Marrow, the chain came to me. Saturday came in gray and still. The garrison ground above Marrow Field is an old plot, a square of cropped grass behind a low stone wall, ringed by limes that were planted when the company that used it was new. Mist lay in the hollows. The grave had been opened the evening before, the earth squared off the way it should be, and beside it on two trestles sat the coffin, plain and pale, with the folded company color laid along its lid. The great silk standard that Holly's Vane had carried as a young man, found in a storeroom and brought out for this, frayed at the fly and faded to the color of a winter sky, but a color still, and his. I had come early, in my best dress, the red wool brushed and the brass burning and the bearskin set just so, and I had stood at the gate of the ground in the half-light to settle myself before the others came. I will not pretend I was calm. A man can stand a wall through a storm and still feel his heart going like a drum when the duty is one he loves and fears in equal measure. But I had Tomas's voice in me. You'll stand it exactly as it ought to be stood. And I had the drill in my body from 40 rehearsals, and I had the photograph in my breast pocket, the two young men grinning, to remind me what the morning was for. Then the witnesses began to come, and the morning grew past anything I had braced for. They came on foot up the lane from the village, because there is no road that runs all the way to the ground. They came slowly because they were old. First two, then a knot of half a dozen, then more behind them, in blazers gone soft at the elbows with medals straightened on the breast and berets and forage caps from regiments I half knew and regiments I did not know at all. The Old Soldiers' Association had said a dozen. There were not a dozen. By the time the mist began to lift, there were near to 200 old men standing in the wet grass around an open grave, and not one of them had ever met Holly's Vane. That is the thing I could not get past, then or now. Not one of them had known him. They had come because of what he was, the last man of a company, going into the ground, and because every old soldier in that field knew in his bones that one day he too would be the last of something, and that what we do for the last man we do in the end for ourselves, and for every man who ever stood a post and feared being forgotten. They had come to witness, so that Holly's Vane would not go down unwitnessed. They had come to keep, with their bodies in a field at dawn, the same promise I carried in my pocket. And among them, near the head of the grave, in a dark coat with no medals showing because he had not come as a soldier this time but as something older and more private, stood CSM Arthur Down. He did not look at me. He looked at the coffin, and at the faded color laid along it, and his granite face did not move, and I understood that he was doing exactly what I did every day on the wall, choosing, second by second, not to break. The chaplain caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. It was time. I want to be careful here about how I tell you what happened, because the temptation is to reach for big words, and big words would betray it. There was nothing big about it. It was small and exact and slow, and that is precisely why it undid 200 hardened men. We are not moved by the grand gesture, those of us who have stood our share of parades. We have seen the grand gesture. What moves us is the small thing done perfectly, the duty kept exactly, with no audience needed and the whole world somehow watching anyway. I took up the color from the coffin lid. It is a heavy thing, a real standard, far heavier than a broom handle, the silk gone fragile and the pike worn smooth by a young man's hand 60 years dead. I brought it to the carry, the great faded square of it hanging down my back almost to the grass, and I felt the weight of it settle into me the way down had drilled, until it was not a weight I carried but a thing I was, for these few minutes, allowed to be. And then I began the slow march. 3 paces and the first pause. The bell in the village church, half a mile off, had begun to toll. Someone had asked them to, and they had, for a man they never knew, and I timed my pace to the bell the way I had been taught, so that the color and the man and the bell all moved together, one slow breath at a time, toward the open ground. 3 paces, and the second pause, and I did not get it a half beat wrong this time. I felt it land clean in my chest, and somewhere behind me, I felt rather than heard 200 old men come to attention without an order given, because old soldiers know a slow march when they see one and their bodies answer it before their minds can. 3 paces and the third pause, and I was at the head of the grave. Now came the part that Down had made me practice more than any other, the lowering of the color. You do not let it fall. You do not lay it down like a flag at the end of a long day. You lower it the way you would lower a man into the earth slowly with both hands, taking the whole weight on your own arm so that nothing drops, nothing jerks, nothing is hurried, and you bring the silk to rest over the foot of the grave at the precise moment the bell tolls its last, so that the color comes home as the man does. I had the count. I had the bell. I began to lower the standard. And that was when I saw, out at the edge of my held and forward-fixed gaze, a figure that should not have been there. A boy. A small boy, perhaps 8 years old, in a coat too big for him, standing at the very front of the crowd of old men, holding the hand of a woman who must have been his mother. He was staring at me, at the color coming down, with the absolute fixed attention that only the very young and the very old can give a thing. And he was holding in his free hand a single white flower, gripped the way a child grips something he has been told is important and does not yet understand. I did not know who the boy was. I could not stop the drill to wonder. The color was coming down on its count. The bell was tolling toward its last. 200 men were at attention behind me, and my whole duty in that moment was to bring the silk to rest perfectly and not to break. And I could feel, even as I held my pace, that whoever this child was, his being here was about to turn this morning into something none of us had come prepared to survive. The bell tolled its last. The color came to rest. I had done it cleanly. The silk settled over the foot of the grave without a jerk, without a drop, both my arms taking the weight to the very end the way a man takes the weight of something he loves and is letting go. And in the stillness that followed I heard nothing at all but the last note of the bell dying out across the wet field, and somewhere in the limes, a single bird that did not know the difference. 200 old men stood at attention. The chaplain bowed his head. And I held my position at the head of the grave, the empty pike now in my hands, the color laid where Holly's vein would lie beneath it, and I waited for the chaplain's word to release the drill. It did not come at once. There was a pause that was not in the order of service. And into that pause, the small boy let go of his mother's hand and stepped forward. I should have held my eyes front. Everything in my training said hold your eyes front. But a guardsman is also a man, and I am not made of the stone they dress me to resemble, and I watched the boy come. He walked up to the grave with the terrible seriousness of a child doing a grown-up thing he has been entrusted with, and he stopped at the edge, and he looked down at the faded color and the plain pale coffin beneath it, and then he laid his single white flower on the silk, very carefully, in the center, where it showed up clean and small against the winter sky color of the standard. Then he looked up, not at the chaplain, not at his mother, but at CSM Arthur Down, who stood across the grave from me in his dark coat with no medals showing. "Is this the man who knew my dad's name?" the boy asked. His voice was clear in the still air, and it carried, the way a child's voice carries, to every one of the 200. Down's granite face broke. I had served under that man for years, and I had never seen it happen, and I never will again. It did not break the way a weak man's face breaks. It broke the way a sea wall breaks when the sea has finally won all at once, and completely, and with a kind of dignity even in the breaking. He went down on one knee in the wet grass, this old soldier who had buried half the world, so that his eyes were level with the boy's, and he said, in a voice I had to strain to hear, "Yes, this is the man who knew your dad's name. He's the one who used to tell me about him when I couldn't say it myself." And I understood, standing there at the head of the grave with the empty pike in my white gloves, the last link of the chain. The boy was the grandson, Arthur Downes' grandson, the child of the son who was lost in service 20 years before, a son so young when he died that he had a child on the way he never met. Holly's Vane, the godfather, the last man of the Marrow Company, had not only carried the dead boy's name through the years for the grieving father. He had carried it forward to the grandson, had been, for this fatherless boy, the one old man who could sit him on his knee and tell him true stories about a father he would never meet, who could say your dad was brave, your dad was funny, your dad held you in the photograph the day before he shipped out, could give a boy the father he'd lost, in the only way a father can be given back, which is in the keeping and the telling of his name. And now Holly's Vane was going into the ground, and with him the last living voice that had known the boy's father as a living man. That was the true weight of this grave. It was not only the last man of a company. It was the last keeper of a dead boy's name. And the boy's son had come, on a gray morning, to lay a white flower on the man who had given him his father. I felt my own composure go then. I will not lie about it. The discipline I had built over 11 winters on the wall, the stone face the world had never cracked. I felt it go, and the tears came, and I let them come, because there is a kind of weeping that is not a failure of discipline but its highest expression. The kind a soldier does at attention without moving a muscle. The kind that says I am still a man, and this is still worth weeping for, and I will keep my post while I weep. I held my position. I held the pike. The tears ran down and I let them run, and I did not break the drill. The boy turned from his grandfather and looked at me, at the great red figure at the head of the grave, weeping and unmoving, and he did the thing that finished us all. He brought his small hand up to his brow in a salute. It was not a proper salute. The elbow was wrong and the fingers were splayed, and he had plainly seen it done, and was copying it as best an 8-year-old can. But he held it, and he held it at me, the soldier who had carried the color for the man who had carried his father's name, and behind me I heard 200 old men return it, 200 lined and shaking hands coming up to 200 brows in a single ragged motion, the most beautiful and broken salute I have ever stood under. And the chaplain, who had forgotten his place in the order of service, lifted his own hand to his eyes. And across the grave Arthur Downes rose slowly to his feet and brought his hand up too, saluting his grandson's salute, saluting the friend in the ground, saluting the dead boy whose name would not now be lost because the chain had reached the grandson, and the grandson now knew the name and would keep it, and one day tell it forward in his turn. I held my salute last and longest, because I was the man at the head of the grave, and it was mine to hold. When at last I brought it down, slow and square, the morning was utterly silent again. 200 men and a boy and an open grave in a faded color with a white flower on it, and a promise, handed from a dying sergeant to a corporal in a hospital room, kept at last, exactly as it ought to be kept. We buried Color Sergeant Holly's Vane then, with the color over him and the flower over the color, and not one man in that field left until the last spadeful was squared off, because old soldiers do not leave a comrade until the work is done. And on that morning Holly's Vane had 200 comrades who had never met him and would not forget him now. I thought when it was done that it would stay in that field. The best things we do stay in small places. That is part of the discipline too, the not needing anyone to see. I went back to the wall the following Monday and took up my post at the Sallow Gate in the cold, and the tourists leaned their phones an inch from my face, and the rain ran down inside my collar, and I stood, the way I always stand, the way Tomas taught me to stand, and as far as I knew that was the end of it. But things get out. I have learned that they do when they are true. One of the old men in that field had a daughter who wrote for a paper, and she had stood at the back and seen it, and she wrote it down, not the way papers usually write things, hunting for the loud part, but quietly the way it had happened, an old man buried by 200 strangers and a corporal who kept a dead sergeant's promise and a small boy's broken salute. She did not name me. I had asked that, through the association, and they honored it. I am only ever a KingsGuard in what she wrote, which is right, because it was not about me. It was about the promise. She gave the promise its due, and she let the rest of us stay nameless the way we like, and then she let the thing go out into the world. And the world, it turned out, had been waiting for it without knowing. I do not fully understand why a small story about an old man nobody remembered should travel as far as it did. I have thought about it on a great many cold nights since. The best I can tell you is this. Everyone, somewhere in them, carries a fear of being the last to remember a mother's voice, the last to hold a friend's name, the last of something that mattered and is passing out of the world. And everyone, somewhere in them, longs to believe that when their own time comes, somebody will stand for them, that they will not go down unwitnessed, that a promise made over them will be kept even by a stranger who never knew them, simply because keeping it is right. That is what we showed that gray morning above Marrow Field without meaning to show anyone anything. We showed that the chain holds, that a word given to a dying man gets kept, that the name does not have to be lost. Letters came to the household, more than I can describe, from people who had no connection to any of it, old men who had been dreading their own last winters, young people who had lost a father the way the boy had and never had a Holly's vein to carry the name forward for them, soldiers serving far off who read it between duties and wrote to say it had reminded them what the uniform was actually for. The association set up a fund in Holly's Vane's name for exactly this, for the burying of the last men of vanished companies, so that no soldier in this country should ever again go into the ground unwitnessed for want of someone to stand. They asked permission to call it the Vane Vigil. Permission was given. It stands yet, and it has stood for more men now than I can count, and that is the part of this that I am proudest of, because it means the promise did not end when the grave was filled. It went forward, like the name. CSM Arthur Down retired that spring. He had served past every reasonable year. I think he had only stayed for Hollies, in a way none of us understood until the end. The last two men of the old days holding the line until one of them had to go first. He came to find me at the gate on his last morning, in civilian clothes, an old man at the rail among the tourists, and he waited until the changing was done and I could speak, and then he said only this: "You stood it exactly as it ought to be stood, Corporal. Tomas would have had nothing to teach you." From Arthur down, that was the whole of the sky. He shook my hand with a grip that was still, even then, a soldier's grip, and he walked away down the forecourt, and I never saw him again. But I heard he takes his grandson to the garrison ground above Marrow every year on the morning, and that the boy, not so small now, lays a white flower, and that they stand together a while in the wet grass, the two of them keeping the name. I still stand the Sallow Gate. The winters have gone on. There have been more of them on my count than there were on Tomas's when he taught me. New corporals come up under me now, the way I came up under him, and they think, as I once thought, that the hard part of this life is the cold and the stillness and the fools with their phones. I let them think it for a while. Then, when one of them is ready, when I see in him the thing Tomas must have seen in me, I tell him about a gray morning above Marrow Field and a faded color and a boy's broken salute and a promise handed down a chain of men 60 years long. And I tell him the thing it took me a whole hard week and an open grave to learn, which is this: the stillness is not the duty we think it is when we are young. We think the duty is to stand and not move and not break, to make ourselves into the stone the world mistakes us for. But the stone is only the practice. The stillness is only how we train, every cold hour, the muscle we will need on the one morning it truly matters, the muscle that lets a man keep his word when keeping it costs him everything he has, and weep while he keeps it, and not let the weeping move him 1 inch off the mark. That is the duty, not the standing, the keeping. We stand so that, when the time comes, we will be the kind of men whose word holds even past the grave. Tomas Ardle gave his word to a man with no one. He could not keep it, so he gave it to me. I kept it for him, exactly as it ought to be kept, and somewhere in the keeping it stopped being his promise or mine and became something larger than both of us. Something that went out into the world and stood, in its turn, for every soul afraid of being the last and forgotten. I do not know who will stand at my head when my winter comes. I have stopped fearing it, because I have learned the truth the old men taught me in that field without saying a word, that as long as one of us keeps the promise, passes it down the line, stands for the man with no one, carries the name forward, then none of us is ever truly the last. The chain holds. It always holds. That is what the still men are really standing for, behind the unmoving faces at every gate in this old country. And on the cold mornings now, when the rain runs down inside my collar and the world leans in close to see if I will break, I stand a little easier than I used to. Because I know what I am. I am a link. And a link's whole duty is simple, and I learned it from a dying man and a grieving man and a small boy with a white flower. Hold, whatever it costs, until the next man's hand closes over yours, and the weight passes on, and the name goes forward unbroken into a morning you will not live to see. That is the promise I keep. That is the post I stand, and I would not trade it for any warmer life in all the world.